this is John Kurikawa. While my clarinets are on the way to New York and Tomochi Hirakata for repair and maintenance, I thought this would be a great time to do a video on 10 tips to help you with the E-flat clarinet. First off, I'm not an E-flat clarinet player, more like an E-flat clarinet owner. That being said, I've been very fortunate to have the opportunity to play E-flat clarinet with some very fine groups like the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra and my own orchestra, the Dayton Philharmonic. When I first got my start, I had Jonathan Gunn, professor of clarinet at Butler University and former principal clarinet of the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra, to thank. Jonathan very generously invited me to perform on E-flat clarinet with the CSO for their performance of Sinfonia Domestica by Richard Strauss, and he even lent me his instrument to use. What a great guy. So I had no excuse. I had to nail the part and sound good. Although I had played some small E-flat clarinet parts in school, and even professionally, I'd never really studied the instrument and didn't have any idea what I was doing. So I had a lot of apprehension leading up to that first rehearsal. Hopefully, these tips will make things better for you if you're first starting this little monster. So let's get going with the tips. Tip number 1, buy the Peter Hadcock book. Just buy it. Peter Hadcock was a longtime E-flat clarinetist in the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and his book has a list of prominent orchestral excerpts for the clarinet, including transposed parts, the full part, for Till Eulenspiegel and for Daphnis and Chloe. It also has a fantastic fingering chart in the middle with plenty of good alternate fingerings for the altissimo register. Each excerpt references these fingerings and even recommends the best one to use in that particular context. Again, I can't recommend this book enough. There's a link in the description if you want to get it, and you should. Tip number 2, there are no shy E-flat clarinet players. Your voicing, airspeed, and embouchure should all be up to snuff on the B-flat soprano. One of the worst things you can do is put a weak soprano player on one of the auxiliary clarinets, whether it be E-flat or bass. A lot of people, including myself, when they first start playing the E-flat clarinet, they play really timidly because they don't want to stick out. However, this results in a very thin, weak, and brittle sound and really bad intonation, which only makes you stick out more. So play out. Voice with a very high tongue position and fast and focused air. You can play loud and you can play soft, but you always need to support loud. Tip number 3, you must have a good setup. This means a mouthpiece and ligature that can take reeds easily. For me, the E-flat clarinet is an extension of the B-flat clarinet sound, and also an extension of the principal's sound. Not some shrill little monster, although that can be kind of fun too. Personally, I look for mouthpieces, ligatures, and reeds that give me a similar feeling on the E-flat clarinet to my B-flat setup. This way, if I'm doubling, it's not a complete and total shock when I pick up the E-flat clarinet. I had a colleague in my section who used the same model Van Doren mouthpiece on bass, B-flat soprano, and E-flat soprano because he claimed the feel was very similar and it made things really easy for him. For myself, I've used mouthpieces handcrafted by Ramon Witkowski for the last 6 years, and I've been very happy. Ramon actually made me a fantastic E-flat mouthpiece out of a vintage Riffaut blank from the 70s. It feels pretty similar to my B-flat setup, which I really appreciate. In my experience, if you're playing the E-flat clarinet, and especially if you're doubling, it's not the time to be biting and chewing to get notes to come out because the intonation on the E-flat is so much more quirky and sensitive owing to the smaller mouthpiece and reed. However, you also have to balance that with the fact that if your reeds are too light, then you're going to have a hard time playing in the upper altissimo. This is going to take some experimentation to work out. Tip number 4, consider using E-flat clarinet reeds. Some people choose to use what they call cutoffs. In other words, a B-flat soprano clarinet reed with the bottom cut off so that it can actually fit on the mouthpiece. Some people do this and they sound great. For myself, I find it much easier to use E-flat clarinet reeds, and I work on them exactly the same way that I do on my B-flat soprano clarinet reeds, including balancing and break-in. Don't be married to a particular reed brand and size. Just because you use Van Doren V12s, for instance, on your B-flat soprano clarinet, don't expect that the same brand and strength in their E-flat equivalent will be the best for you. You may need to go up or down in reed strength, or use a different cut, or maybe even a different brand. It all depends on your mouthpiece, instrument, and you. One last tip regarding reeds. If you're doubling, that is to say switching between E-flat, soprano, and or bass, Consider using a reed that's slightly lighter than what you would normally use. When you're picking up the E flat, the reed will be dry and it won't vibrate as easily. If it's just a little bit softer, then it'll be that much easier for you. Tip number 5, apply the same studies on the B flat to the E flat. This includes long tones, scales, etudes, and yes, even solos. The more you play the E flat, the more it becomes a part of you, the more you get used to it, and less like some foreign thing that you eye suspiciously from opposite corners of the room. Plus, long tones can give you a sense of the intonation of the instrument and how it differs from the B flat soprano. The throat tones can be a little bit more variable, and the altissimo can often tend towards flatness rather than sharpness. By the way, if you're enjoying this video, please consider leaving a like below and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps. I truly appreciate all of you and want to make the best content for you. Now back to the tips. Tip number 6. The E-flat clarinet requires a more focused airstream than the B-flat soprano and a slightly more pressure-oriented approach to the mouthpiece. I try not to think of it that way though, because that can lead to biting. Instead, I try to think of the aperture in my lips. I think about the shape of the airstream and what I need to do in my embouchure to make that happen. Because of the smaller size in the mouthpiece, my teeth have to be a little bit closer together. And you absolutely have to voice with a very high tongue position and very fast air. Tip 7. Get your own instrument if possible. When I first started playing the E-flat clarinet, I had a pretty good mouthpiece that I felt comfortable with, but I was always borrowing E-flat clarinets. I'd bribe people with pizza, pop, or whatever I had to in order to borrow a good instrument. When I got my own instrument, though, it changed everything. I was pretty fortunate to have a good selection from which to choose, but if you need help, I would consider enlisting the help of an E-flat clarinet specialist to assist you and make recommendations. Which leads me to my next tip, tip number 8. Try to get some lessons with an E-flat clarinetist. Perhaps somebody from your local symphony orchestra. There are some differences on the E-flat clarinet, particularly in the altissimo where you spend a good amount of time. For instance, I've heard rumors that there's one prominent orchestral E-flat clarinetist on certain notes in the altissimo. They tend to finger them a half step higher and then lip them down to combat the flatness that we often encounter up there. That, plus the other challenges on the E-flat clarinet, an E-flat clarinet specialist can help you overcome those. Tip number 9. Coming off tip number 8, keep those alternate fingerings handy. This leads me back to the Hadcock book, an excellent place to start. Oftentimes, an alternate fingering will produce a better result than the standard fingering. The eagle-eyed among you may have noticed that in the beginning of the video, I overblew open G for altissimo D, and I overblew throat A for altissimo E flat. If you tried those on the soprano clarinet, you'd get laughed off the stage. But on the E-flat clarinet, they work very well. Again, the Hadcock book and an E-flat clarinet specialist are invaluable to assist you with this. And finally, tip 10. Don't be that E-flat clarinet player who sits on stage before rehearsal or at the break, blasting super high notes into a tuner at triple forte. As a good colleague of mine in the Dayton Philharmonic would say, that's an at-home activity. It's really fun to play the E-flat clarinet and dive headfirst into a loud tutti passage. But we also want to be aware that the E-flat clarinet can be very loud and can be damaging to our colleagues' hearing. Plus, when we have to play softly and tune well with other instruments, this is where all the goodwill that we've accrued can come into play. Be considerate of your colleagues both before rehearsal and at the break. Again, being kind and being empathic and being understanding can go a long way towards making you well-liked and to working out any intonation problems that may come up. And that's it. I hope this helps. As always, thank you to everybody who has liked, subscribed, and left comments. It really means a lot, and I greatly appreciate all of you for watching. Thanks, and I'll see you next week. Take care.